Welcome back to the World Lens podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Evans, Senior Manager of Digital Marketing at WTCI. And today I'm joined by my co-host, WTCI board member and president of McIndoe Risk Advisory, Bruce McIndoe. How's it going?
Well, last month of the year and snow is falling.
Not here. It's actually raining, which is, I thought it was going to snow, but in
Yeah, part of the
downtown, it's
country's
raining.
covered, so it's been a rough Thanksgiving holiday travel week, that's for sure.
I can imagine. So today we're going to discuss the recent G20 Summit, which was held in South Africa. Trump boycotted the G20, calling it a disgrace. Um, Question: has the U.S. inadvertently accelerated the multipolar shift it fears? And what leverage did we lose or sacrifice by not being in the room?
Oh, what a way to start. So let's say, by essentially boycotting, right? He didn't send anyone of any significance,
Mm-hmm.
leadership-wise from the U.S. He effectively handed over to the other powers there more room to shape the global agenda and global rules.
Right.
So it's I guess without it, without being there, I would say they're accelerating the very multipolar drift that I think that they should be worried about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but on the leverage part of it, I think is clear. With the U.S. absence, basically means they forfeit agenda setting, so they're not influencing that. The ability to block anything around climate change, whether it's debt structuring or other frameworks around that,
Mm-hmm.
and the chance to build relationships on the sidelines, right? And we saw that with other countries happening. So, I
Yeah.
guess more importantly to me, the move, undercut the U.S. credibility with its allies and the
Agreed.
global south, which we'll talk about, I'm sure,
Mm-hmm.
signaling that Washington may no longer be a reliable player in these multilateral governance organizations, and a vacuum that others are already filling, China and others notably. But,
Yeah, it's definitely pretty notable. That was all the news was about. The last couple weeks was how we were not there, especially because this is the first G20 summit that was held on African soil. And it's the fourth year consecutively that it was led by a global South nation, like you mentioned. Is
mhm.
this what you think a genuine power rebalance or just a temporary window before, the Western powers regain control?
So it's more than a symbolic moment for the global
Mm-hmm.
south, right? But it's not yet a full structural shift, and I hope we'll talk more about that. It sits, right, I would say, in the middle. I would say more toward the shift than the
Mm-hmm.
dead middle. But it is a genuine rebalancing, in a sense that the global south countries now command enough, economic weight, diplomatic coordination, especially with each other. They have
Mm-hmm.
political confidence that's been building, especially when it focuses on their agendas, which is they're most impacted by climate. They're
Yep.
impacted by, getting development for their, the demographics and youth that are going to be, present
Mm-hmm.
in these areas in the decades ahead. Debt, digital policy, energy, all of that is incredibly important. So I would say it is very unlikely that the West can simply reclaim control, right? The old model where the US and Europe kind of dominated everything is eroding. And,
Yeah.
I think that the emerging economies, just like I said, with demographics and driving demand, are going to drive most of that global growth. So the bottom line is the Johannesburg, the recent G20 summit, it's a long-term structural tilt toward a more plural, multipolar order. And that balance is still contested, sure, but it's going to shift. And when it becomes permanent, we're going to be, I guess, making it more permanent, I guess. The global South assertiveness, how assertive they're going to be, and whether the Western powers choose to adapt and retreat from that will be the kind of like the give and take and conflict starting
Yeah.
next year in the U.S. Right, so we'll see this play out more.
Yeah, speaking of which, for next year, so President Ramaphosa of South Africa refused to hand the gavel over to a
Oh yeah.
junior U.S. diplomat, basically saying it was a breach of protocol. Could this signal that, these middle powers are willing to rebuke these major powers when they're like publicly disrespected by these boycotts?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
We can make this a short one. No, let's see. So I guess this is was a very important moment, and
Yeah.
obviously highlighted by media, right? That Ramaphosa's refusal to hand that gavel to a junior diplomat, which I just said we sent no
Mm-hmm.
significant executive level leadership to the meeting, right? Reflects a growing confidence, as I was saying, with the middle powers and the global South, and
Right.
to push back in when they disregard protocol or show disrespect, it signals a shift toward that
Mm-hmm.
assertiveness, and so I think it's really important. And as expected, Trump responded by signaling that he will not invite the president, Ramaphosa, to the G20 to be held in the United States, right,
You're
next
not
year, which
invited
I
to my
think
party.
it's. So now we'll see. This will be kind of a test, right? So now we'll see, what are the other G20 members going to do, right? Are they going to come to his
Mm-hmm.
support or not? And either way, I think it's going to say a lot about how assertive they will be or can be as
Yeah.
we move through next year.
It's shocking. Well, not really shocking. It's just kind of troubling that this was like his response to that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's I think everyone worldwide is learning how to deal with him or what to expect from him, and then how to deal
mhm.
with so I think it's helping lower the chaos level, because they know pretty much, if I make this move, this is the response I'm going to get from the US and from the Trump
Mhm.
administration. And so they're knowing how to kind of how where to push that and how to play that. So I think things are, well, they're not easy. These countries have a little better sense of how to maneuver. So.
Yeah. So the declaration committed to debt restructuring and scaled up finance, but critics call it unaccountable rhetoric. What G20 economies actually have the capacity and political will to deliver on those promises?
So, I'm not an economics expert by any chance. So I actually listened to a really wonderful webinar along this, because I was really trying to
Hmm.
look at how what happened around debt and what happened around the economic elements of the
Right.
G20. And what this individual said only a small subset of G20 members can meaningfully fund or enforce debt relief, right?
Figured.
And none currently show the political will for the scale of what needs to be done, right? So
Right.
they were viewing all of that as largely aspirational.
Hmm.
And so when I kind of looked at this and summarized it, I would say, if I had to game it out, that the only countries that I saw in this webinar that had both what I would call high capacity and moderate will, not no
Hmm.
will, would be the EU, right? So especially
Mm.
Germany and France, along with our partners, somewhat waning, Japan
Hmm.
and Canada. So that's how I would see it, kind of net from that webinar.
Hmm. Interesting. So the U.S. cut manufactured imports from China by 6 percentage points, while Mexico and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations,
Asian,
they
yep,
kind of gained ground. But China's exports to Mexico surged with about $120 billion in trade surplus.
yep.
Are we seeing like some real diversification, or is it just these Chinese goods taking a detour?
Yeah, it's a good question. My gut reaction would be to say it's just taking a detour, but I
Yeah.
think the truth, like anything, lies but in between, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no question that there's a real diversification underway in U.S. supply chains and sourcing
Mm-hmm.
them. So, and much of that sourcing actually benefits China, right? And still, because most of the critical components that start that whole process or somewhere in that process are Chinese components, whether they're routed through Canada, Mexico, or anywhere else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're still benefiting from that trade demand and pickup from demand. It's just now shifting to what countries, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Mexico, that are benefiting from that final stage before it delivers. So I would say in many cases, it's more of a detour than anywhere near full decoupling. So that,
Mm.
yeah,
So ASEAN became the top destination for U.S. exports while remaining China's largest trading
yep.
partner, right? Can this balancing act kind of hold up? What's going to be the tipping point where strategy ambiguity becomes impossible?
When I saw that you were going to talk about this, I said, okay, I'm going to look at this. Is a not an easy question to just say this is what it is. So,
Yeah.
there's no there's the Asian countries can hedge their bets while tensions stay competitive. But
Hmm.
once they approach a coercive rivalry or a real security crisis, the region's room for ambiguity narrows like sharply, right? So the
Hmm.
individual states, not ASEAN as a group, will be forced to choose. So I started to look at like, well, what would be some of these tipping points, right? And
Hmm.
there are four that kind of came out, but that I thought were explicit and strategic ambiguity would be impossible, right? So if
Hmm.
Washington starts conditioning market access, technology, or security guarantees on alignment, especially around like semiconductors, AI, and other critical minerals as they develop the capacity, that would be a tipping point. There's no way
Yeah.
that you can pick one or maintain both, right?
Hmm.
If China begins imposing penalties on closer, security cooperation, for example, then again, they would have to use, maybe they're going to use, trade measures and investment restrictions from their side, right? So again, that would put them in a bind to have to make a choice, right?
Hmm.
If there's a major crisis in the Taiwan Strait with Taiwan or South China Sea, and we see that playing out literally every day, forces the governments to choose between defense ties with the U.S. or their economic dependence on China. Very
Hmm.
difficult choice in that regard. And then the other one, of course, was what we were just talking about: is this supply chain bifurcation. If it
Hmm.
advances far enough, where it becomes very much two separate supply chains and not one that's kind of commingled early and then finished out somewhere else, then they can no longer operate seamlessly across both systems. They have to pick: am I going to be in this supply line or am I going to be in that supply line? So those are kind of the four uh, big ones to think about, like what would force a tipping point and a decision point. But will not be kind of one or more of these tipping points. It's the only question in my mind is when are one
Yeah.
of these tipping points going to be presented to them? And unfortunately, it seems like that's accelerating.
Yeah, it does. So you said you wanted to talk about the structure of, governance moving forward. So, India, Brazil, South Africa, they coordinated to keep development and the UN Security Council front and center at the summit. Meanwhile, Putin skipped due to his ICC arrest warrant. Zai sent someone else instead of ascending. And we also discussed Trump boycotting with three of the world's most powerful leaders absent. Is this global South agenda sustainable when the US takes over next year? Or is it what we're going to witness is the emergence of a parallel governance structure.
Yeah. As you know, I talk a lot on this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it is absolutely sustainable in the near term, only because the global South no longer needs like great power attendance to drive its agenda. We talked about that earlier, right?
Yeah.
And so when the U.S. chairs next year, there's no question that that center of gravity will shift.
Mm-hmm.
But India, Brazil, South Africa, the African Union, the Asian nations can coordinate effectively amongst themselves. And they've already built institutional systems like BRICS Plus and BRICS Pay,
Mm-hmm.
right? They have the G20 Sherpa tracks going on outside. They have South finance platforms that they've created. So they've built these institutional capabilities and habits for this explicit reason, right? They
Yeah.
don't depend on great power leadership. And that's what we're seeing. So my bottom line when I talk about this is the global South agenda is absolutely durable, but not
Mm-hmm.
hegemonic, which will hopefully that'll be a good thing. And in 2026, the G20 may fracture into two overlapping systems: one
Mm-hmm.
U.S. Western quote unquote led, and the other global South led, without fully replacing each other, but now operating in two
And
spheres that are going to
yeah,
cooperate. That's where I think this will be now. Will it be 2026 or seven? But we are absolutely heading,
heading in that
no,
direction.
not we, these groups are preparing and executing diligently to that objective.
Mm. Mentioned BRICS. They just expanded to 10 members and now control over 40% of the global population and 37% of GDP, with 32 more nations expressing interest in joining. Um, is BRICS positioning themselves like as an alternate structure, like we mentioned, not necessarily replacing it, but building, that parallel system for countries to keep existing and seeking alternatives to our US led economic order.
Whew.
I
So,
know.
yes, that's precisely the trajectory that I just talked
Hmm.
about, right? And BRICS expanding by 10 members and definitely more. Well, I think you
Hmm.
said 30 some nations.
Yeah.
That is BRICS plus. That's the how you talk about that, right? BRICS plus.
Ah.
So that expanding group, like I said, is not trying to replace Western institutions, but building a parallel ecosystem, right? So
Hmm.
that's where that's coming from. So um, as we discussed in our podcast last season on de-dollarization, I'm going to
Hmm.
bring that in because the rise of BRICS Plus and its de-dollarization agenda, right? These countries are trading with their own currencies. They're
Yeah.
not trading with
They're
the
not
US
trading with the
dollar,
dollar.
right?
Hmm.
It pretends and I would optimistically say gradual, but definitely real erosion of the dollar's global dominance, especially in trade among these nations, but potentially between these two blocks. That has a lot of direct and rippling effects to our cost of service debt and our position as far as strength in global affairs. And go listen to that podcast, and now you can understand where that is coming from
Hmm.
and why that is a pressing issue for the U.S.
Yeah. So, kind of want to get back to this declaration.
Uh-huh.
It mentioned Ukraine one time, while European leaders worry that Trump's peace plan leaves Ukraine kind of vulnerable. What does the silence reveal about the global South's priorities when it comes to this?
Um, I would say the silence, with the U.S., China, and Russia absent, right, or disengaged.
Mm-hmm.
The European contingent lacked any leverage to push stronger language around Ukraine, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
so that I would say that was like the crux of it, right? But then when you come back and say, well, what about the global South, right? Well, yes, their priorities are not Ukraine. In fact, they view the war in Ukraine as a regional conflict, not a
Mm-hmm.
defining global issue that they really have to worry about. And,
Yeah.
they're also unwilling in the language that was floating around to frame the war in Western terms, where we use aggression and deterrence and democratic, defense and all
Yeah.
those kinds of things. But also, they all have their own strategic and economic ties with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So here's where you sit, just like we talked about, is like now they're have a foot in each camp. Better to shut up than create pain on
More
either
power.
side, right? So that's
Yeah.
why that you know is there, and it shows that the G20 is increasingly reflecting global South priorities because
Mm-hmm.
of all the reasons that we just said is around economic growth and dominance and where they're positioned and growing and where they will be is giving them significant latitude to do so.
Yeah. Like most of these African countries spend more on debt interest than on healthcare or education. What specific
We
metrics do you
spend more
think?
on defense than healthcare and education, but go ahead.
Well, the African countries do not. What metrics do you think we should track over the next year to know, like, if these promises actually translate into some real relief?
Yeah, and that was actually when I saw this, it was in that webinar they talked about
Mm-hmm.
this. Again, I'm not an economics, expert by any stretch. So this is what came out of that, and I put here in quotes in my notes here: watch for actual restructuring deals versus promises. Falling debt service ratios and increased concessional flows are the key things that they're looking at, right? If
Mm-hmm.
those numbers don't move in the next 12 months, the G20's promises will have been political theater, not material relief. So that's
Mm.
out of that webinar, right?
Yeah.
Um, so when I listen to this some more and try to get to I always like to have the bottom line, right? As if I had
Mm-hmm.
to focus on one metric from their discussion, and I think it makes a lot of sense, would be the debt service to revenue ratio, right? One
Okay.
number. In this one number, it captures whether the countries that you're measuring are actually getting fiscal breathing room from debt relief, right? If the ratio drops, meaning the governments are spending a smaller share of their revenues on interest and principal,
Mm-hmm.
that tells you that there's real relief. If the restructuring concessions and all these other things don't happen, then it just doesn't move and nothing meaningful has changed. So
Mm-hmm.
from that discussion, I'm summarizing kind of where it would sit would be that metric.
So we talked about Trump hosting in
Okay, back to
2026.
Trump. Okay.
Yeah, at his golf course in Florida,
Uh-huh.
um, which is crazy. But if you could add one structural reform, not to fix it, the G20,
Hmm.
but to make it relevant, what would it be?
Yeah, this one gets kind of like, wonky.
Mm,
So only because it is in real conversations. If we're talking about this potential fragmentation, bifurcation of G20, like what would actually bring it together in a global governance sense? We need it to stay together. We need it to actually function, and it's not right now, right? We have
mm-hmm,
lots of different interests that are pulling things apart, and what the wonky part of it is if we had a global governance institution, and one of the titles that's been discussed out there is the Global Critical Infrastructure and Supply Resilience Authority, so CISRA. So put that in your memory banks, right? But the concept here is that this institution will be a permanent treaty-backed body, right, with the power to set standards, coordinate financing, and most importantly, coordinate triggered and collective action when things go awry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what do things mean? Critical minerals, semiconductors, clean energy, food systems, digital infrastructure, all of the critical global things that need to be governed for the benefit of everybody on this planet
Mm-hmm.
as we move forward in the decades ahead, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
I love this quote. I said this institution would not be another yak fest forum. It would be a functioning institution with enforcement and money anchored in the G20, but serving global markets. So again, this would coalesce that whole governance concept around the G20 and keep
Mm-hmm.
them, relevant and important, right? So, uh, and from my perspective, every systematic crisis kind of in the last decade or so, so in energy and food and shipping and chips and supply and infrastructure, have been, supply and infrastructure shocks to us, and I do feel like an institution like this would become indispensable, in that it can help prevent those, but more importantly,
Mm-hmm.
and this is the key thing, have a coordinated global response to those shocks to deal with them rather than fragmented or certain blocks trying to outposition others, right? So it's a
Mm-hmm.
way bit aspirational, but they need something like this to keep some level of tangible relevance. Otherwise, we're
Mm-hmm.
just going to see this thing kind of just fragment into pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned like these critical minerals. Basically, the declaration was saying that it should drive value addition and not just extraction. Africa holds the lithium and cobalt that the world needs. Is this language enough to prevent another cycle of resource exploitation or no?
My short answer would be no.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the language, as I read it, points in the right direction, but it's nowhere near enough to prevent another exploitation cycle.
Okay.
So the declaration's language, is like, as a lot of times, and part of that relevance issue was symbolic progress, right, but not structural
Mm-hmm.
change. So preventing another round of extraction without development will require coordinated producer policies, real financing, binding commitments, all the things that make it real, none of that which the G20 has delivered. So again, this comes under the heading of YakFest, nothing, not substance.
Mm-hmm.
When we see those things out of the G20, then that'll have real substance.
I mean, with everything happening, how much longer is the G20 summit really going to be relevant? I mean, you mentioned like at the summit there were a lot of these side deals, and what does it mean when a lot of these nations and their biggest players negotiate outside of these like multilateral forums?
Um, I think it's part of the thread that we've been pulling through this conversation, right? In my
Mhm.
mind, it signals a fundamental shift.
Right.
The real negotiations are moving outside of this forum, right?
Mhm.
And so I right, and the G20, as we saw, is becoming more of a like stage rather than where a
Mhm.
venue where power is really exercised and global decisions that are enforced are made, right? So this is why Macron and Carney raised
Mhm.
the alarm bells. And
Yeah.
when these biggest players go outside the G20 and you know negotiate political and trade issues, it signals that global governance is shifting, right, from
Mhm.
this multilateralism to selective interest driven multilateralism, right, if you want to use that term.
Mhm.
So, I think it remains and will significantly important, but its ability to shape outcomes shrinks every time this happens. And again back on the trajectory that we're on a very fast pace to be a multipolar, multi-economic sphere world. Post
Hmm.
giving up the post World War II model pretty rapidly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Can't wait until next year when we talk about the 2026 G20 summit to see what actually happens.
Yeah, it's I think it's in December next year. I forget what time, but so it'll be a little colder, quote unquote.
Oh, Bruce, thank you so much for
Good.
discussing this with me today. And thank you all for tuning in. To learn more about our events, insights, and member news, visit WTCI.org. And you can also connect with us on all of our social channels at WTC Institute. Until next time.